The goal of my presentation today is to essentially urge law enforcement to consider adopting a social network approach when dealing with juvenile delinquency. I think it's fitting that I'm following Robin because she alluded to using social network analysis in her intervention. And I also want to make it clear that what I'm actually advocating for is both the tool itself, because it can shed insight on crime problems in a way that can provide very important guidance for interventions and for programs. And at the same time, by adopting this general approach, it can actually urge you to ask different kinds of questions that would provide unique insight that would otherwise be missed by having a sort of traditional toolkit that law enforcement typically employs. Now, when I use the phrase social network analysis, I'm referring to two things. The first thing is a general approach for understanding social behavior that emphasizes the social relationships, linkages, connections that ultimately define group structure and group processes. Secondly, I'm referring to a variety of analytic techniques that one can actually use to study these linkages and these relationships. To me, it's sort of akin to crime mapping in that these analytic techniques can range from very basic and very descriptive, which oftentimes are the most helpful, all the way up to the very complex statistical modeling techniques that provide precise insight on very specific questions. And so there's a very large range. And so it's not that I'm advocating for using very high-end statistical techniques. I'm advocating for approaching things in a somewhat different way and acknowledging that oftentimes the descriptive information that comes from that approach can be incredibly insightful. There's a growing literature in criminology that uses a social network approach when studying organized crime, street gangs, prison threat groups, co-offending, and other types of criminal networks. And it's this literature that informs my four main reasons why I believe this approach can pay dividends for law enforcement. First, a social network approach can provide guidance on specific points for law enforcement intervention. For example, I want you to imagine a jurisdiction that has a significant gang problem that is generating an increase in youth violence. Sounds familiar? Just imagine that you're listening to Robin's presentation again. And imagine that in today's climate, shockingly, there are limited resources. And so you have to make some choices about where you're going to direct those resources. You can't address every single gang in the jurisdiction. It's simply not possible. And so you're going to have to start to make some difficult choices. And one of the ways that you can start to think about how to make that choice is to map out this very simplistic map, where you look at the gangs that are in your jurisdiction and you look at who is connected based upon rivalries and who is connected based upon alliances. And if upon your initial problem analysis you find that rivalries are really driving this increase in violence, then you find that one particular gang nominates itself for focus. It rises to the top. If you're able to address this gang, if you're able to dismantle this gang, you may find that that drive of rivalries, that drive of violence, you find a disproportionate decline. So something as simple as that can actually be quite beneficial. Not only has Robin used social network analysis for her intervention, but the first Boston Gun Project, the original Operation Ceasefire, did just this to help figure out where should it direct its focus. As a different example, you can imagine a jurisdiction where the kind of gang that they want to focus on, the specific gang that they want to focus on, is very clear. But perhaps the size of that gang is so large that they can't wrap their brains around where do they start. They can't go after the gang problem. They have to make some choices about who within that gang will they address. And so here, these squares represent gang members, and the links would represent who's connected to whom. Very basic, very simple. Now, looking at this, it's very difficult to discern who do I start with? Who do I kind of leverage? Who nominates themselves for focus? You may find that certain subgroups nominate themselves for focus once you employ social network techniques, or you may find that particular people nominate themselves for focus when you take a closer look. So that red square is the same person here. I've just teased it apart so you can see that this person occupies a very important position. This person is what we would call a broker, or in this case, he's also a cut point. This is someone who serves as the only connection between people in this overall network. So from an intervention perspective, this person may be ideal to speak to if you're trying to communicate a deterrence message, because this person can spread the message in a way that no one else can. It's just you get more bang for your buck. Alternately, if you're interested in a more aggressive intervention strategy, by dealing with this person, you're able to dismantle the organization much more powerfully than if you were to pick any other random person in the gang. The second reason why I believe that adopting a social network approach is important is because it urges police to consider how non-criminal ties may be crucial for understanding the structure and activity of a criminal network. When you adopt a social network perspective, it urges you to think about relationships. It urges you to think about connections. And we know that within criminal networks, people are connected in a variety of ways, not just by common gang membership, common membership in an organized crime group. They can be related through kinship. They can be connected based upon residential proximity. They could go to the same church. They could share activities. They could have financial exchanges. There's a variety of ways that people can be connected. And if you acknowledge that and you try to gather information on that, you can actually have a much better sense of what the structure of this group is, and you may find that certain people who nominate themselves for focus are not traditional members of the group of interest. For example, this person who we highlighted, this broker or this cut point, could actually not be a member of a street gang. This person could be a community worker who helps members of the street gang secure social services. He's doing his legitimate job. He's doing a great job. But he clearly holds a very important position in this social network. It could be a local priest or a local reverend who organizes athletic events to help the community. And it so happens that in the street gang, you have sort of two athletic teams, and he's the key organizer for them. If you know that, now you have a potential partner for collaboration through team policing, through problem-oriented policing, through a pulling levers approach that you would completely miss if all you did was say, just tell me who the gang members are. The third reason why I think adopting a social network approach pays dividends for law enforcement is because it urges them to consider different types of criminal networks other than street gangs or organized crime groups. For example, in recent years in criminology, there's been a growth in research on co-offending networks, people who commit crime together. These tend to be very temporary, very transient relationships. People come together, commit a crime together, and then that's it. We know that when it comes to juvenile delinquency, most juveniles offend with others, and the typical juvenile delinquent act includes more than one person. This is not some incidental characteristic of crime, it's meaningful. Oftentimes, co-offending is how people first get into offending if you're a juvenile. It's how they learn additional criminal skills. It's how they learn to recognize a variety of criminal opportunities and to leverage those for committing more crime. So if we focus on co-offending and address that, we actually have an opportunity to have reductions in crime in the short term, in the long term, and also to reduce the burden of case processing on the criminal justice system. Finally, in the most basic sense, a social network approach urges law enforcement to think about the power of the group. A collection of juveniles is not simply a sum of its parts. We know that when juveniles are in collections together in informal, unstructured settings, that even people who otherwise would not commit crime or violence can be compelled to do so because of the presence of others. And by adopting a social network approach, it reminds us to think about group process and group power, and to not simply turn our heads away from youth who are not known to commit crime because they could under certain circumstances when in certain kinds of social networks. Thank you very much.